In 2006, as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, Ted Haggard preached about the sinfulness of homosexuality and keeping secrets.
For nearly 2 decades, one evangelical leader built an empire that placed him steps away from the nation's highest office until a single phone call in November 2006 unraveled everything he had constructed. Ted Haggard seemed to have it all: a thriving congregation, political influence that reached into the West Wing, and a reputation built on unwavering moral conviction. But what followed that call would become one of modern religion's most shocking downfalls and an even stranger resurrection. What happened after his public confession was something almost no one saw coming. The architect of an empire born in 1956 in Indiana, Ted Arthur Haggard arrived in Colorado Springs in the 1980s with ambitions that the city itself could barely contain. In 1984, he gathered roughly 24 believers in a basement space, sharing a vision so compelling that growth never truly stopped. Over the next 22 years, that basement congregation would transform into something few religious leaders have ever achieved. By the mid-2000s, what started as a handful of people worshiping in somebody's home had expanded into a sprawling complex serving around 14,000 worshipers on Sundays. The physical campus alone cost roughly $60 million to construct. Church records suggested that virtually every attendee came through conversion rather than simply transferring from competing congregations, a marker Haggard supporters pointed to with genuine pride. But the story was never only about one building in one city. Alongside the main congregation, Haggard also created the World Prayer Center, a coordinating facility for one of Earth's most extensive intercessory networks at that period. This wasn't just institutional expansion, it was empire building on a national stage. Beyond Colorado, he founded multiple networks of independent churches, each amplifying his theological influence and personal authority. By 2003, his profile had reached critical mass. The evangelical movement selected him to serve as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, an umbrella representing approximately 30 million believers across thousands of congregations nationwide. For someone in that role, the perks of proximity to power came quickly. Haggard reportedly participated in routine phone calls with White House officials during the Bush years, giving him access most pastors would never encounter. He became a fixture on cable news, a featured speaker at major religious conferences, and notably, a prominent voice in the 2006 documentary Jesus Camp, where he publicly delivered fierce critiques of same-sex relationships to his own gathered believers. Few American religious leaders combined institutional authority, media visibility, and political access the way he did. His entire public identity rested on one central claim: his private life embodied the values he preached from the pulpit. The fracture everything pivoted in early November 2006 when a Denver massage service worker named Mike Jones went directly to local media with allegations. Jones claimed that Haggard had hired him for intimate sessions spanning roughly 3 years and had also involved an illegal substance in their interactions. The account spread across national news outlets within 48 hours. Haggard's initial reaction oscillated wildly. First, he told reporters standing outside his residence that he'd purchased an illegal substance and received a massage, but denied any sexual component to the relationship with Jones. Within the same news cycle, however, the church's own leadership contradicted him publicly, confirming to television stations that Haggard had already privately confessed to facts beyond his public denials. The contradiction was devastating. Here was a pastor caught not just with the allegations themselves, but caught lying about the allegations while his own organization exposed him simultaneously. Days later, his carefully maintained career collapsed. On November 2, 2006, Haggard submitted his resignation from every single role: president of the Evangelicals National Association, senior pastor of New Life Church, board member of every ministry he'd founded. A letter read from his own pulpit described him as profoundly dishonest and spiritually broken, confessing to what he termed serious moral failures without specifying the exact details. An independent clergy board tasked with investigating his conduct issued findings considerably harsher than his own prepared statement. The situation, they concluded, was far more grave than his initial admissions suggested. In 2007, he signed a $200,000 separation package requiring him to leave Colorado Springs permanently, sever all ties to church members, and undergo extended therapeutic intervention. His carefully orchestrated downfall became the subject of an HBO production and multiple television appearances, transforming a private collapse into the most visible evangelical implosion of the era. The complication nobody expected, what few people initially realized, was that Mike Jones's accusation represented only the beginning of what would surface. Months after the Jones allegations broke, New Life Church leadership disclosed that a separate young male church volunteer, a man in his early 20s, had also come forward. Church officials initially characterized this relationship as mutually agreed upon, based on what they described as extensive documentation. But in 2009, that same individual, Grant Haas, publicly identified himself with a radically different account. Rather than describing a consensual relationship, Haas characterized the interactions as non-consensual and coercive. Haggard responded during television interviews by acknowledging struggles with compulsive behavior during that season of his life, without outright disputing Haas's characterization of specific encounters. The distinction between church claims and Haas's own recollection highlighted just how contested even the basic facts of Haggard's past remained. Repentance, it seems, kept requiring repetition. Gail Haggard, his wife since 1978, made the unexpected choice to remain married through the entire scandal. She later authored a memoir titled Why I Stayed, offering her own perspective on the decision. Within those pages, she disclosed details Haggard himself had never publicly confirmed, that during his childhood around age 7, he'd experienced what she termed an inappropriate encounter with an adult. She theorized that this early trauma had cultivated struggles with same-sex attraction persisting into his young adulthood. A framework she believed explained the pattern without absolving him of responsibility. Gail also referenced an earlier episode in Louisiana involving an adult entertainment establishment, further suggesting a complex personal history that predated his public ministry. Critics viewed her decision to stay married with skepticism, questioning whether her loyalty had perhaps enabled the very cycle about to resurface. Supporters, by contrast, pointed to her public partnership with him as evidence of genuine redemptive potential and marital commitment under extraordinary duress. The second act, after roughly 4 years of complete absence from pastoral ministry. Ted and Gail relocated back to Colorado Springs, the very city where his reputation lay in ruins. Rather than attempting to disappear, they chose instead to reconstruct their lives within view of everyone who remembered his fall. In 2010, they established a new congregation called St. James Church, rather than immediately reclaiming a massive auditorium. Services initially convened inside a converted agricultural building on rural acreage, a stark visual contrast to the $60 million campus he'd previously commanded. Gradually, the congregation relocated to a conventional church facility, building something recognizable as a functioning ministry, if significantly smaller in scope. The comeback narrative didn't remain confined to local Colorado news. In 2012, Ted and Gail appeared on the celebrity reality program Wife Swap, effectively inviting national television cameras into their reconfigured family existence. For someone attempting to rehabilitate his public standing, the calculated media presence worked. For several years, that rehabilitation appeared credible. Haggard adopted a particular rhetorical strategy. Rather than distancing himself from his past, he positioned his previous downfall as the crucible from which his spiritual authority now emerged. My greatest failures became my most valuable lessons about grace. He told audiences that his personal wreckage had granted him insight into human weakness that successful, unblemished pastors could never genuinely access. The narrative was compelling. A fallen leader remade through suffering, now capable of ministering to others navigating similar struggles. St. James affiliated with the Free Methodist denomination, representing a significant institutional departure from his original Southern Baptist credentials. This denominational shift reflected his altered ecclesiastical position and signaled an intentional break from his megachurch past. By 2016, Haggard had launched yet another entity, the network of redemptive churches, explicitly organized around pastors who'd experienced public scandals and subsequent attempts at restoration. His personal journey had evolved into an entire organizational philosophy, making his comeback a framework through which other disgraced clergy might potentially reclaim their vocations. The pattern emerges again, but beneath this carefully constructed narrative of recovery, something troubling was reportedly already resurfacing. In 2012, while providing spiritual guidance to a church member battling serious drug addiction, Haggard allegedly solicited that same young man to procure an illegal substance on his behalf. The allegation was particularly disturbing because it occurred within the precise institutional setting where Haggard had positioned himself as a healer of destructive impulses. When a church elder confronted him directly, Haggard reportedly acknowledged the incident and produced a briefcase containing the illegal substance in question, a well-used smoking device, and adult materials. Rather than issuing a public disclosure, church leadership apparently handled the matter internally. That decision to contain the matter privately, rather than bring transparency, would prove consequential in ways that became apparent years later. By 2019, additional allegations surfaced. Two young adult men connected to St. James allegedly reported to a fellow pastor that Haggard had engaged in inappropriate physical contact with them on separate occasions. The testimony was reportedly recorded and distributed to church leadership, yet public disclosure never followed. Congregation membership visibly declined as these accounts circulated quietly through the community. Multiple departing members later explained that they'd left specifically because of escalating concerns about Haggard's continued pastoral authority. When journalists began investigating these newer claims, Haggard declined to directly address the specific allegations. Yet his influence over the remaining congregation apparently remained undiminished. Several former St. James participants, including a pastor who'd worked closely with him, publicly characterized their first-hand knowledge of ongoing substance involvement and inappropriate interactions with church members. One pastor explicitly called for his removal from leadership, a request Haggard reportedly never seriously entertained. Even as membership dwindled, Haggard continued leading services. Remarkably, he reportedly delivered at least one sermon while participating in recreational four-wheeling activities alongside youth from the congregation, continuing his pastoral role even as allegations against him circulated within the exact community he claimed to shepherd. The disconnect between his public spiritual authority and the private concerns swirling around him had become nearly total. The final retreat by 2022, facing mounting public allegations and a substantially diminished congregation, Haggard sold the St. James building entirely. Services relocated into his private residence, rebranded as Story House Church. Marketed as a deliberate home church or micro-church model, attendance had shrunk from 14,000 to somewhere between 40 and 60 regular participants. Remarkably, during an Easter sermon that same year, Haggard publicly discussed renovating his own basement specifically to accommodate youth programming, complete with recreation amenities to draw young people into the space. The optics were startling to observers familiar with his history. A church elder, speaking anonymously to reporters out of safety concerns, characterized Haggard as extraordinarily persuasive and psychologically manipulative, someone whose explanations and excuses possessed a compelling quality that kept drawing people back, despite overwhelming evidence of past conduct. Rather than substantively address the fresh allegations, Haggard employed his own pulpit to revise the historical record of his original 2006 crisis. In an August sermon that year, he claimed to have repented instantaneously during the initial scandal, a narrative fundamentally at odds with the documented record of him spending days denying the Jones allegations before eventually stepping down. The revision rewrote history to present him as having responded with immediate contrition rather than initial denial, followed by forced confession. He publicly rejected the newest accusations wholesale, telling his small congregation that he refused to permit what he termed demonically inspired rumors to dictate his existence. He announced with certainty that he had no intention of stepping back from ministry regardless of what continued emerging. He further reframed the original 2006 scandal, characterizing the original accuser as someone who'd never genuinely understood him, effectively casting himself as misunderstood by an outside observer rather than caught in genuine deception. The legacy question, what makes Haggard's trajectory so difficult to process, conclusively follows a repeating sequence: public exposure, partial acknowledgement, quiet reconstruction, new allegations surface, then another slightly smaller sanctuary to retreat into. The 14,000-seat auditorium became a converted barn. The barn eventually condensed to his own basement. Those who've remained with him across all 3 chapters cite his own expressions of contrition and a philosophical commitment to second chances as sufficient justification for continued loyalty. Those who departed, former congregants and church administrators, point instead to a documented repeating pattern now spanning 16 years across 3 separate congregations. They argue that repentance occurring repeatedly is categorically distinct from authentic transformation. The pattern had become the defining feature. An additional layer of irony has never fully dissipated from observers' minds. Here stood a preacher whose national prominence was substantially constructed on forceful public denunciations of homosexuality, denouncements delivered to his own gathered believers on camera, who was ultimately brought down repeatedly by his own private conduct operating along strikingly similar lines. Whether that irony demonstrates a man genuinely battling internal contradiction or something considerably more calculated, repeating itself behind increasingly private doors, remains genuinely contested among those who were there. Religious journalists tracking Haggard's story across all 3 institutional iterations have raised a structural question beyond individual culpability. How do independent, self-directed congregations respond to recurring allegations against a founding leader when no higher denominational authority possesses the capacity to forcibly remove him? Unlike hierarchical church structures where a bishop or regional authority could theoretically intervene, Haggard's self-founded congregations left decisions entirely within his own authority. That structural vulnerability helps clarify something otherwise astonishing: how a pastor facing 3 separate waves of serious allegations across 16 years repeatedly founded a new, progressively smaller congregation rather than submitting to outside institutional accountability. Whether this reflects a broader accountability gap within independent religious movements more generally, or something particular to Haggard's intentional design of every congregation he's ever founded, remains genuinely unresolved and contested. From a 14,000-seat megachurch to basement sermons in his own home, Haggard's arc became something exceeding a single scandal. It became a story about power, secrecy, reinvention, and questions that stubbornly refused resolution. But after uncovering the full timeline, one question persists: was this genuinely a redemption narrative, or merely a pattern repeating itself in progressively confined spaces? Drop your perspective in the comments below and hit that like button to support Crime Brief as we continue investigating stories history prefers to forget. Subscribe for more investigations that mainstream documentaries consistently overlook.